Okay, finally I give you Machiavelli as promised. I'm going to ramble a bit on this talk, partly because it's something that fascinates me, but mostly because Machiavelli is one of those figures that think has been largely misinterpreted, either through the fact that it has been covered by political scientists, and we'll wonder whether Machiavelli really fits into that camp very well, or whether he's really properly a humanist, but also because his reputation was such that in his own day, and certainly immediately after the book was published, I think in the 1530s. It was written, remember, in 1513. It circulated in manuscript for quite a while, and then it was published. But almost immediately, within a decade, it's on, I think even before then, it's on the index of forbidden books. So the church bans it. Even in England, Machiavelli has a kind of reputation as an evil villain, figure. You call someone a Machiavelli or Machiavellian, and that kind of reputation stuck with him. And I want to, in this talk, kind of question whether that's fair to poor Machiavelli, whether we really should look at the circumstances of when this was written, look at his character in particular, and look really at what he's saying in the book that has come to be, his most famous, The Prince. But I think we need to take a little time and look at the discourses also. And normally in this course, we actually read the Mandragola, the Mandrake route. We won't have time to do that, but maybe if I can find a production online, we'll all look at that on Monday. But for today, this is Friday, let's start just with a quote, and let's think of what this means. Machiavelli ends The Prince with "Che l'antico valore nell'italici cor non è ancor morto." The great valor of the Italian hearts is not yet dead. Now, why would he put that in there? I think it comes from Petrarch, actually. That should tell you something about his relationship to humanism. But why would he put a quote like that in there, unless this was a very particular set of circumstances where Italy was being threatened, where someone thought the great valor of Italian hearts was somehow dead. And by Italian, he means the peninsula Italy. He could actually mean ancient Rome, if you want to think of it that way. But he certainly means what has happened, the threat that has been posed by France and Spain. I think that's really what he's thinking about, Italy. And I think if we can consider everything we were just talking about about the development of nation states, I think that really gives you the context for this whole book, and in particular the very specific circumstances of its writing. But let's think. Let me give you just a brief anecdote to talk about why I have. I wouldn't say it's an unpopular opinion, but it's not the opinion you'd read in a textbook or certainly a Western Civ class. Well, when I started teaching Machiavelli, I think the book was kind of thrown at me in graduate school when I started teaching contemporary civilization. That was the name of the course at Columbia. That's not actually what it was at all. It was mostly political theory. And in fact, the second semester, I think we started with Machiavelli and went to, I think we read Cardinal Richelieu's Political Testament. We read, of course, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, all the way through to, Hegel, Marx. It was a great course. Don't get me wrong. But I always thought Machiavelli just kind of didn't fit in there, right? Were the things that he said really about political realism? Were they really about realpolitik? Did they point the way toward, the 20th century? The course was often called Plato to NATO, and we sort of, were thinking with, I guess when the course was designed, or at least by the time it had changed in the mid-20th century, people were thinking Henry Kissinger, and political realism, and they sort of saw in Machiavelli a realpolitik figure, as someone who presaged their own ideas that you have to be realistic. Ideals are wonderful, but they Wilson era and the League of Nations let us down because look, it led to World War II anyway. And I think when that course was the version that I taught of it was in the period of nuclear proliferation and Cold War politics, and so it was read in that light. And I think that Machiavelli, he wasn't exactly a hero, but they wanted to make him a political scientist. Okay, now think of what science means. There is no scientific method when Machiavelli is writing. There's no, they're not taking statistics about opinions or doing surveys or even charting political attitudes. So there's nothing really scientific about it. He's not making a hypothesis and testing it in that respect. But Machiavelli is actually taking the evidence that he has from mostly ancient history and also contemporary politics. We'll see he talks about Cesare Borgia and figures like that. And he's using it as the material data to make predictions about what should be done, what's going to happen. He makes predictions, actually, throughout the Prince. And in that respect, he might not be scientifically minded, but he's certainly a political thinker, and a new kind of political thinker. And one of these things that always struck me is I was having a conversation, and this is like the first year I am teaching my own class. I think it was 1990. So I was like 24 years old, and we were talking about Machiavelli, and the sort of stereotypes and the heroes that he picks out, in there. And someone in the class said, this is all very nice, but any ruler who actually wants to keep his job knows this already instinctively. They might say one thing and they might, but in reality, the way that what informs their actions has to be Machiavellian for them to succeed. And I said, that's actually a really good insight. I don't know whether anyone has ever really, followed the so-called medieval sort of ideals of kingship. Well, maybe they did. We'll get to that in just one second. But let me talk about that. So, political theory in the Middle Ages, and there is a whole variety of theory. I don't want to kind of stereotype this. In fact, even Thomas Aquinas is a very interesting political theorist, but I think the kind that really became popular in the late Middle Ages, the thing that is representative is this whole genre called the mirror for princes. Okay, and what that means, Lydgate, Thomas Lydgate is the best English example of that. And Lydgate wrote basically that for an ideal Christian prince, that's Hesse barking, if you can hear the stupid dog next door. For an ideal Christian prince, the virtues that are, and the moral standards that are in individuals should be exactly the same as in a prince. So if it is a good thing to show mercy, for example, as a person, an individual, that's a Christian virtue, it's a good thing to have for a prince, right? To show mercy towards his enemies. If it's a good thing to be generous and offer charity as an individual, of course, that's what's going to get you into heaven. Why wouldn't it be the same morality for a prince to, give to his subjects and to share and everything? And so all the sort of, love, charity, peace, mercy, all those things that were considered Christian virtues for individuals, the assumption was this is the same stuff that will make you a great prince. And I think the kind of ideal princes, if you want to think of, maybe St. Louis. St. Louis was King of France, went on crusade and died, did a disastrous reign, but he was considered one of those ideal kings because he practiced Christian virtues. And of course, as anyone knows, if you practice mercy toward your enemies, they stab you in the back. If you practice too much charity, you go broke and you can't finance your government. And so it's things like that I think everyone was thinking this. Everyone knew not to be stupid, but no one actually said it until Machiavelli. No one actually said, think about the consequence. Think of the end, the final outcome of your actions. And if the overall outcome is good, then you could consider that moral, because morality in a state is actually a little different than for a person. The goal is not salvation, as it would be for an individual. It's actually the survival of the state. Not just for your own good, but the survival of the benefit, the public weal, the good of the whole. And that's what you should base your action on. And then Machiavelli is not the first person to think that. He's the first person to write it. But again, does that make him modern? Does that negate the very specific concept, very specific circumstances of when he wrote this book? I think that will make this whole question a lot clearer. Okay, so just keep in mind the Lydgate tradition of the mirror for princes, the advice given by political theorists to kings. There's dozens of these, in fact, that should tell you how to be a good king. That's a little different than how to run a state. Now, one thing that sort of kind of throws this into, I shouldn't say confuses it, but it makes it more complicated and interesting, is of course we know in the late Middle Ages, Aristotle had been recovered through the Arab versions, even before it comes directly from Greek to Latin. And Aristotle's Politics laid out, if you remember, we talked about this at the very beginning of the course, a scheme for understanding different kinds of states. And Aristotle thought a kingdom would actually be the best form of government. One person can make decisions very quickly and efficiently, and if you have a good king, that's the big if, then that has the potential to be the best form of government, but it's really very shaky, because the worst form of government is a tyranny, and the line between good kingship and tyranny is the decisions of one individual. So that's what makes it really, really precarious. So if you look at that whole spectrum of states, a tyranny is the worst form because it's one individual looking out for his own best self-interest, and turns out tyrannical. One individual looking out for the interest of the whole is a kingdom, and that's good. Slightly, if we move in from that spectrum, a bad form of government would also, people looking out for their own best self-interest, would be an oligarchy in which people look out for their own interests. They tend to be the wealthiest. So it's a small group of people who are just there because they're wealthy for no other reasons, kind of like Venice, right? When we talked about Venice, that make decisions for their best self-interest, not for the interest of the whole. And it's a little more sturdy because you don't have, one person changing their mind is not going to change the whole thing, but the powerful are the wealthy. And you probably know many people have said, well, the United States is in form really an oligarchy because the people that control the country and support the candidates and keep them as puppets are corporations. It's the wealthy, it's not the good. So the good form of a government by the few, acting in the interest of the whole, would be an aristocracy. And of course the Middle Ages like that idea. They like this idea that, well, we have kingship, but we also have aristocracy, kind of checking them, especially in England. Remember where there was the Magna Carta that theoretically limited the power of the king, and gave aristocrats the good. Whether they were good because they were born into being aristocrats, who knows? But aristoi, in Aristotle's mind, meant the good people, right? The best people, aristo. Then we get the whole mass of people voting in their own best self-interest, and everyone theoretically getting one vote. That's a democracy. And in Aristotle's mind, it's a bad form of government because everyone is not thinking what's good for everyone. Everyone's thinking what's good for me. That's what I'm going to do, and I don't care. We often like to call ourselves a democracy. We're not. We have a representative kind of government. One person doesn't get one vote. We have an electoral college. We have representatives that make decisions for us. But theoretically, a democracy is more stable because those people, one person's not going to sway the entire whole. Although you can have a demagogue, right, come and sway the opinion of everyone, and that's a danger. But in its pure form, democracy is kind of stable. But we know from ancient times, Athens, kind of fell apart, and so that was the model that I think most Greeks had in mind of why democracy was so dangerous. The ideal form of government, it's not perfect, it's slow moving, but it's a polity, and that's on the good side of the spectrum, in which there are many different forms of government. You might have a kind of consul or shared executive between one or two people. You might have representatives. You might have a democratic element. So a republic kind of fits into this idea of Aristotle's polity. I would say ancient Rome, the Roman Republic, fits beautifully into this. The United States, obviously, when people like Montesquieu were trying to think of balanced forms of government, they had Aristotle in mind, right? So just keep all this categorization in mind, because when Aristotle comes to Europe, political thinkers have this in mind. Now, the thing that I kind of confused them, and I don't really know enough to talk about in detail about the reception of Plato's Republic. I don't think it was actually called the Republic. I think Cicero gave it that title in ancient times. But in any case, a system of government, an ideal form of society. Remember, the Renaissance humanists were the first generation to read Plato's Republic, and I don't know what the hell they made of this. It's confused people ever since. And in fact, it's one of the most fascinating books, because of course it's written in reaction to Athenian democracy and its failure, and proposes that the best rule and make the guardians, make the decisions, and are raised, but in such a way that they cannot be corrupted, because they don't have property, they don't have money, and they don't get married, they don't live in families. So I think this was a really weird, I think it confused Europeans a whole lot, what he was talking about, and it still confuses people. Modern political scientists have said Plato was the roots of totalitarianism, really. The people don't get any decision, they're just like workers, and decisions are made by the learned people, the good, I don't know. So just keep that in mind as we go through the various different kinds of systems. Plato's in their mind too, but in all of these theories, there's a distrust of people, notice, and there's a trust in the goodness of individuals, and kingship is still the ideal form of government. One good ruler, because it mirrors the heavens, right? There's God on top and angels and humans, and the idea was that, maybe that's the way things should. Hierarchy is inherent, order and decree, as Shakespeare put it in. I think it's in Troilus and Cressida. Ulysses talks about the everything falling apart when there's not ranks and orders in the heavens, in the state, and in the household, and at every level of government, right? Good government. And think also, remember Dante's Inferno, the bottommost pit of hell. The lowest rung is reserved for Brutus, who committed who committed regicide, right? Killed a lawful ruler, and in Dante's mind, as in most of his contemporaries, kingship was the perfect form of government. Now, of course, that's not the case in Italy, right? We do have one kingship there, Naples, but Italy, remember, as we've been talking throughout the course, is an exception to all of these weird rules, because feudalism doesn't dominate there, because the small city-states, in some cases republics, have these earlier, medieval Italian communal traditions, the communes, and traditions of political liberty. And when they read about classical and antique republics, like the Roman Republic, they said, well, this is our roots, this is where we belong. Remember, Florence likened themselves either to ancient Rome or even more to Athens, right? Remember the Leonardo Bruni comparing himself to Pericles. His oration was modeled after Pericles' oration to the city of Athens. So I want you to think that there is that tradition of communal representative government, of towns having their own liberties and their own representative bodies, their courts, their regional parliaments, their town councils, whatever they were called. But the general trend in the 16th century, and this is going to maybe run counter to what you might expect, because we tend to think, democracy runs forward and political freedom and liberty increases as we go toward the present, and it's a very Whiggish, positivist, 19th century attitude that many people still have, even if not explicitly, they think that way, is that we're working toward political liberty, and it's all these tyrants you have to fight against, and I hope you recognize that today, but that's not the way it works. It goes back and forth between authoritarian governments and more liberty, more democratic systems of government. And the trend in the 16th century, counter to what you might expect, is toward the strength of the crown. Is toward well, let's just use the term. It's not in place yet, but it's absolutism, right? It's this idea that the king is the source of the government. When Louis XIV says it, l'état c'est moi, I am the state. And I think, Jean Baudin really is the most representative political theorist of the 16th century. I think he's writing in the 1560s or so. And remember, in the context of French civil wars, we haven't really talked about those yet, but his idea was people are not responsible. We have to give over our power to a leader who has absolute power over the law, because that's the only way a state will be secure. Otherwise, we're going to break out into horrible civil wars and things will go badly. And that's a necessary thing for the security of the state, is absolute power, no representative governments, no haggling with nobles, and certainly not independent power of nobles. That's the general trend in the 16th century. And I think for most rulers, that, even not French ones, that seemed very appealing. Remember, Charles V had this idea of a universal empire that would be all Christian, that he would rule all of Europe, and he came very, very close to it, and then would defeat the infidel. Of course, he was fighting against Turks, in the Mediterranean. And that would continue all through the 16th century, I should mention also. So that idea is there in Charles V. It's also there in, remember, Henry VIII. This idea of Caesaropapism, which comes to the fore. It's not quite yet. It's 1629. It's with Thomas Cromwell. But in Henry's mind, the Byzantine Empire looked like the ideal state, where the king was head of the church and of state, and the two policies went hand in hand, and you had a kind of theocracy, if you want to call it that. Caesaropapism is what they called it. That was obviously useful for Henry to get rid of his wife and to become head of the Church of England, what would become the Church of England. But I just want you to see that those ideas are floating around, that a universal kind of emperor would be the ideal form. And in that case, Italy, with its little republics and independent communes, is the exception to the rest of Europe. And I think if we want to understand Machiavelli, let's get back to him, it does not make sense. The whole book does not make sense unless you think of Machiavelli first and foremost as a Republican. Remember, his part was as the secretary to the Confalionere, to Piero Soderini, not more or less the president of the Republic, when Florence threw out the Medici, when they declared their independence, and the French were kind of supporting that, and they Machiavelli was the Secretary of State, pretty much, literally writing the letters out, but also right there at the center of this very large representative institution that supported the populo grosso, the populo minuto, the little people, not the big people, and he was part of all of that. And when the Medici, remember, Savonarola was burned 1498, somewhere around there, and the Republic went on its merry way, and the French and the Spanish came back. This is still actually Ferdinand, and destroyed the Republic, put the Medici back in power. And in fact, if you want to look at your little chart that I gave you back when, for those of you who are just watching this for whatever reason, don't steal this idea. It's my treasured possession, this lovely chart. But I want you to look at 1513, where Machiavelli fits. Giuliano de' Medici was put in place in 1512. I think he only lasts a year. And then Lorenzo is put in. So in the book, he's called Lorenzo d'Urbino. Remember, this is not Lorenzo the Magnificent. He's a relative. I don't remember the exact relationship. And he was the Duke of Urbino for some reason, somehow, or had some connection to Urbino. So that's the title that he's given there. You might sometimes he's called Lorenzo II, but he's de' Medici, but not Lorenzo the Magnificent, of course. He comes in right about there. A Medici Pope is put into the papacy. Again, Spanish power assures this. it is Leo X. Of course, we all know Leo X, right? Built the St. Peter's, and we'll get to him when we get to Luther. He started the whole thing. The other rulers at the time are Louis XII, who's about to die. Francis I takes over in 1515. Again, the trend toward national, centralized monarchies, nation states. And Charles V is ruler in the Netherlands at this point. He gets the crown of Spain from Ferdinand in 1517, and then buys the position of emperor in 1519. So but it's this period of transition between the late Middle Ages, or let's just say the 15th century rulers coming in and fighting in France in the whole Habsburg-Valois Wars, but the cast of characters is right about to change. And I mention that because Machiavelli knows it. Okay, that is the whole setting for The Prince, is this idea that, look on the horizon, folks. We have already been beaten up by the French and the Spanish, and their power is growing, and he knows, I mean, he couldn't guess what happened with Charles V, but it does get bigger. Their power does get stronger. They bring bigger armies. They have bigger wars, better equipment and muskets, better formations for fighting. The Battle of Marignano happens just a couple of years after this is written. So does Machiavelli know what's going to happen? Absolutely. He understands that Italy will not stand up to big nation states, and the key to survival is unification. Okay? Now the whole, and I'm giving away my whole idea about what Machiavelli is about, is that that sometimes times are ripe to unify, sometimes they're not. Sometimes, Italy has never been in a great position, but in certain circumstances, there are individuals who might actually unify everything and might hold off the barbarians, meaning the French and the Spanish, and we might survive. We might not be dominated by them and divided. And of course, his prediction in the long term, well, he's right. Those countries chop up Italy. Milan, in the long run, is ruled directly by Spain, as so is the Kingdom of Naples and Sicily. Florence becomes a grand duchy. The papacy goes its own bizarre route, in the course of the Counter-Reformation. Venice holds on, but you remember they're knocked out by the Portuguese economically, and they move, and Venice becomes a Disneyland. I mean, Venice becomes a tourist spot, really. I mean, that's how they keep the tourist industry, oldest tourist trap in the world. And so Machiavelli could have predicted all of that would happen had Italy unified. And of course, they don't until 1860, right? I mean, this is long going. Okay, so I'm going far from the text. But let's again think of the context. Let's think of the 1513. Machiavelli is exiled. I'm pretty sure he's tortured also when the Medici come back, and he's outside of the city, basically writing back to Lorenzo d'Urbino, please give me my job back. I'm really not so bad. And maybe this is the message ultimately, maybe you're the person who's going to unify Italy and save us all. And again, let me stress that Machiavelli knows the whole situation, partly because he was also a diplomat, and in the early 16th century, he kind of he went to the courts of Louis XII and of Maximilian, who was the emperor at the time. And so he kind of knows what's going on, and I think the other thing to keep in mind, and this is running counter to what I'm saying, but Machiavelli, in his time in the Republic, writes this book called The Discourses on Livy, and I don't have enough time to really go into detail about that, but I think if you want to get a really true picture of what Machiavelli is about as a Republican, in his Republican years when he's working as secretary, the discourses are 100% Republican in content. All right, they're about Livy, of course, was the ancient historian who wrote about the Roman Republic, and Machiavelli just kind of elaborates on it. But it's really a unique book. It's not just commentaries on Livy. It's a discourses about why, when you are ruling your own people, a republic is the best form of government. The prince is something different. It's not about domestic policy. It's not about how you rule your own people at all. It's about what would happen if Lorenzo or some other figure managed to take over every other city in Italy and unify it. How do you treat these conquered peoples? And I think that is the fundamental misunderstanding of most modern political scientists and even many historians about understanding Machiavellian context, is that this is about how you rule people you have just taken over. And it's a different game, because they're not going to like you, and they're going to stab you in the back, and they're going to do everything they can to get away from you. But if you want to survive, if you want to build a state, a nation state rather than city states, and if you want to hold back the French and the Spanish, you've got to play with a different game. You've got to do things that might be considered ruthless. You might have to learn how not to be good. And that's the one sentence that gets Machiavelli in the most trouble, of course, historically. Learn how not to be good, meaning don't behave like Lydgate's ideal prince and show mercy toward your enemies. Do something like Cesare Borgia did. And I have to say, Cesare Borgia is a weird figure for a hero, but Machiavelli at one point says, look at what Cesare Borgia did. There was one person he put in charge of, I can't remember this town, Ancona maybe, and this guy betrayed him, did something he wasn't supposed to, and in the middle of the night, Cesare Borgia has this guy cut in half, one half placed on one side of the town square, the other half on the other, and just left that as a message for the city. And that worked, and Machiavelli admired this. Now, it was rotten to do to that one person, but you betray him, and you want to really hold on to that city, and you want to unify, and you don't want to be decimated by foreign powers. You got to resort to things that are sometimes should be considered perfectly dreadful. But that's the point, is that the morality for an individual should not go around cutting people in half, is different than a ruler. A ruler has to think of the good of the state. Did this help the state in the long run? Well, he thought it could. He thought Cesare Borgia could have been one of those people to unify Italy. Turns out, fate, the fortune, o fortuna, remember fortuna, velut luna status variabilis, semper crescit, o decrescit, semper in Angaria. Remember the wheel of fortune? Vanna White spins it, and then you're on top at one moment, and then you're at the bottom. Fortune is fickle and blind, and oh God, Machiavelli's language when he talks about fortune is it's really disturbing. I mean, he says you have to force fortune, she's a woman, of course, to do your will, to use violence against her when necessary, and it's really cringing and misogynistic and rape. I mean, it's just horrifying. But what he says is sometimes things go wrong, and in Cesare Borgia's case, it was his pop, Alexander Borgia, Pope, Alexander VI. Sorry, Cesare is Rodrigo Borgia is his name. Alexander VI is his title as Pope. Is on top. He dies suddenly. Cesare Borgia loses everything. The papal states, falls up. Well, it doesn't fall apart in the wake of that, but it causes. It wreaks havoc, and that's Julius II comes in, right? So, okay, so the question that has always worried people is, which is the real Machiavelli? Is it the Machiavelli of the discourses where he's a Republican, or is it the Machiavelli of the Prince where he says to do all sorts of dreadful things? And I think that that's really not a real problem. I think that the confusion here is, again, the discourses are a book on how to rule your own people, and the Prince is about how to rule foreign people who you've just conquered. And it's not a there's no real inherent contradiction in Machiavelli's thought at all. I don't see. One book is about how to rule the Florentines for them among themselves. The other is how to rule Siena and Pisa and Bologna and who knows what all of Italy that you're gonna take over, and then you're gonna have to do some rotten things. You're gonna have to abandon conventional Christian morality. Now, does that mean he's thinking secularly as a political scientist? I don't really think so, but the kind of invasions that he's thinking of are going to demand a strong leader who at times will have to be ruthless and who will have to be feared more than he is loved. Your own people, you want them to love you. That would be ideal. That's a perfect situation. But those people who you just took over, yeah, if they love you, they may change their mind, as of course every little Italian state did at the time. They may change their mind when when the winds change, or fortune spins you on the other side. But if they fear you, if they think you're going to come and cut them in half, then they're going to think twice. And so that's political realism, right? That's just a fact. And sometimes fate controls 50% of what happens. The other 50% is in our hands. And sometimes opportunity strikes, and you've got to seize that moment. And that's really what this book is about. It is for desperate times. It's not a book of political realism at all. It's about a very a serious situation that might require cruelty in the short term for larger political goals. For example, let's imagine you had to oust a rival family from power to hold on to your city. This happens all the time. Remember, in Florence, families are exiled. Now, should you say, to be fair, well, they haven't really everyone in the family hasn't done anything wrong. Let's be fair and just and follow the laws. Well, that's not going to get you very far, because you exile one person. Let's be realistic. They're going to grab the opportunity for revenge whenever they can. And to hold on to the city, you might have to be unfair. You might have to be cruel and ruthless. And maybe even if they're that powerful, you might have to slaughter that whole family. Is that fair? No. There's no personal, standards of morality would allow that. And it's not like we're thinking, like Jeremy Bentham or someone, or that the greatest good for the greatest number of people is the standard of morality. So if you have to shoot that one bomber to save the 100 people in the room, and that's not what he's thinking. He's not thinking, statistics like that, but he is thinking about the final outcome. Si guarda al fine runs throughout this entire book. It's look toward the outcome, look toward the ends. Now, does that mean, let's consider this carefully, because this is the real stereotypical misunderstanding of Machiavelli, that the ends justify the means. Does that mean you can do anything as long as you have a good outcome? And in fact, if we look closely at Machiavelli, he says no. There's some things that you just should not do because they don't make political sense. So for example, there's a place where Machiavelli says a man will sooner forgive the murder of his father than he will the loss of his patrimony. Meaning that you can kill his father, that'd be okay, but if you take away his inheritance, he's going to come and get you and will never forgive you. And so there are some things that are politically just very stupid to do. And you shouldn't be a stupid ruler. And there are things that he thinks are just immoral and don't make sense. Lying is not one of them. Okay, now let me be clear about this. This is another one of these stereotypes that runs through thought about Machiavelli, where he says that, well, you have to look like you're religious. You don't have to really be it, but make a show of piety. And you all know every ruler will do that as a matter of course, as a rule. Because anyone who thinks that way looks at you and says, "Oh, that person's immoral." So you have to make it look like you're a moral person, but behind the scenes, of course, you don't do moral things. And here's the thing that I think makes the most sense is I should say Thomas More would agree with him on this in the Utopia. They're roughly contemporaneous, remember. that if it will cost you a great deal in battle, it's not an honorable thing if lots of people are going to die. It's better to lie. It's better to lie to your enemies or lie to get what you need to do. That deceit is actually a much safer and more sensible thing to do than to send your people into battle, which, remember, in the Middle Ages would have been considered glorious, and go, and if you die in battle, that's fine. Well, no, that's stupidity. Let me put it this way. I'm thinking of Henry VIII, who is probably the perfect example of someone who is not Machiavellian, who will go into battle for glory, even though he loses men, and he still thinks he can conquer France, and goes, that happened just about the same time that Machiavelli was writing. So, anyway, just so you know, not everyone's a smart ruler or follows all of this stuff, but sometimes you do have to avoid a greater evil in order to justify your actions. That's not exactly the same as the ends justify the means. Any good outcome will justify absolutely any action. Would you destroy a city to prevent it from being taken over by the French? I don't know. He's definitely not saying do whatever you want to, and he's certainly not saying all situations require cruelty and fear. It's these desperate, really, awful situations that do. Let me give you an example, a quote from him, just to clarify this. This is Agathocles is the person he's talking about. You should not be cruel just for kicks. It cannot be called virtue to kill one's fellow citizens, to betray one's friends, to be without faith, without pity, without religion. By these methods one may indeed gain power, but not glory. So he's not saying be cruel indiscriminately as a matter of policy. He's just saying in the weird situations when you really have to do it, go ahead and do it. And again, the original is si guarda al fine, look toward the outcome, because purposeless cruelty, it will most likely get you a much worse outcome, because people are going to kill you, right? I mean, he has plenty of examples from ancient times to show that. Who's my favorite is Heliogabalus, or Elagabalus, is just the cruelest, weirdest person, and his subjects kill him and throw him in the sewer, basically. So, in any case, but when you need to be vicious, be the man when you can, but also be prepared to be the beast when necessary, crafty and underhanded and violent, and and be deceptive when you need to. His model in this case is Pope Alexander VI. This is Rodrigo Borgia, who is the greatest liar ever. He loves him. And his heroes are interesting. Ferdinand of Spain, of Aragon, out of Spain, was also one of his heroes, because, as we know from the lecture on the Habsburg-Valois Wars, lied all the time, through his teeth. Consistently, and that's something that Machiavelli admired about him, I guess. But of course, you avoid scandals. You want people to think you're virtuous. Don't do horrible things if it's going to harm your state. But I think in the end, Machiavelli really does think the vast majority of people are stupid. They can be convinced. If modern politicians have learned anything from Machiavelli, this is it. Most people just tell them what they want to hear and make sure you look good. It has nothing to do with what you actually do. What you say is very important. How you say it is more important. It's understanding public relations more than anything. And I think he's the first political theorist to maybe not to realize it, but to admit right out front that political image is much more important than reality. And again, Ferdinand is his hero here, because he keeps saying, Ferdinand keeps talking about keeping the peace, and he's always making war. He's always talking about the importance of keeping his word, and and then he goes and attacks, Naples. I mean, he lies all the time. And the question is, well, what does Ferdinand have really that the Italian city-states don't? It's a strong, centralized state with its own armies, with its own little empire going on, and of course, right as he's writing, it's going across the seas also, and did he get there by being nice or fair? Look at what happened in the New World. It's ruthlessness, cruelty, deception work there. If Cortez learned his lesson, Cortez, actually, I never thought of that connection, but Cortez is, of course, a Machiavellian through and through. How do you rule a conquered nation? A perfect example. Machiavelli would not have known that, of course, right? That's 1520s. This is written 1513, but man, it's close. So, again, what he's looking to is his contemporary state builders, Louis XII, Henry VII more than Henry VIII, certainly, and Ferdinand, because they are, well, let's think of these folks. They're penny pinching, they're deceptive, they do anything they can to increase the power of the crown against their nobles and aristocrats. They finagle marriage contracts left and right rather than go to war. That's what makes them successful rulers. That's what makes those nation states in the first place, folks, right? It's exactly that. And so let's get back to Machiavelli. So what he's doing here, more than anything, is he thinks, okay, if we just look at the vast panoply of examples that history has to offer, let's try and come up with some general rules, maybe even laws, about how people will react, how political behavior will affect people, and let's try and calculate how you should act. This is advice for you, potential ruler, in a given situation. And he says we have to start with some basic assumptions about human behavior. And he says that humans are bad. We have to start with that basic assumption. Expect them to do rotten, selfish things, and you'll almost always be right. They do good things out of self-interest. They do good things for whatever reason, but it's not for its own sake. And history, therefore, has a very didactic use. We're studying it to understand the contemporary situation. He's a humanist in that regard, folks, isn't he? I mean, he's saying history has this very, useful kind of application for the present. In coming up with these general laws. Now, again, I don't know whether that makes him a political scientist, but he is trying to predict the outcome of events in the past, events in the present, by comparing them to events in the past and judge how to act now. And I think that is, in fact, what distinguishes him from political thought before, is that it's not models of noble behavior and moral exemplars. It's what worked and what didn't, what saved the state, what didn't, and what was a good indication of how people are going to behave, not how people ought to behave. You see the difference? They're two totally different things. And in that respect, he is secular minded. What is he looking for? The ultimate good of the whole state? I think so, right? He doesn't say forget religion, that it's just nonsense. But he does say if you need to act irreligiously, it's necessary. You have to keep the pretense of piety, of course, but and nothing. He says nothing will get people to hate you more than seeming to be impious. So go to church, pray, and pretend you're really into it. But if we're predicting human behavior again. I guess we've already covered the idea of, better to have them fear you than, so that town with the guy is cut in half, that's Cesena, not Ancona. Close enough. I was thinking geographically. So let me just read you a little quote here about that. I know I'm just going back and forth, but in order to purge the minds of the people and to win them over completely, he resolved to show that if any cruelty had taken place, it was not by his orders, but through the harsh disposition of his minister. This is really underhanded. And having found the opportunity, he had him cut in half and placed one morning in the public square at Cesena with a blood-stained knife by his side. If that doesn't inspire fear in you, I'm not sure exactly what would. But that's and as for the the laws, I've mentioned this before, but the ultimate law. Let me give you the exact quote here: "Men forget more easily the death of their father than the loss of their patrimony." I was pretty close, right? I'm just looking at my notes now and finding that. So, so the ultimate ruler is a strong ruler who can unite Italy against the foreign invaders, who can prevent internal strife, and create stable institutions. Right? I mean, that's ultimately what this is about. And I think, if you look at, again, the discourses are about balanced constitutions. That's not something you can have when you're building a state and taking over your neighbors. Once you have power, well, then of course it's ideal. Then you put in something where there's, you share government and you have consuls and a senate and tribunes to to represent the people. That's a free state, right? I mean, that's what you're talking about. You're governing your own people. It's quite different when you have to govern those who you've just taken over. Another big question, and this is one that I think is kind of interesting because it's a big political argument throughout the next 2 centuries, is do you have citizen militias? Do you have the citizens fight and defend their city and take over, obviously other cities? That would require a kind of standing army. And of course, for historical reasons, many states don't want a standing army, that would have replaced the aristocratic kind of, and not just aristocrats, but mercenaries, right? The whole idea in Machiavelli's mind is you hire mercenaries, they're going to change sides when the first opportunity they do. If you're interested, read The Art of War. I mean, Machiavelli, it's probably even more interesting in some ways than The Prince, but it's about, it's about the nitty gritty nuts and bolts of armies, and why a citizen militia, trained soldiers defending their own property or extending dominion over other ones, they have a stake in winning this. Mercenaries don't, and feudal aristocratic retainers are more loyal to their lords than they are to the state. So, I think this is, anyway, it's got very long historical consequences, about that, even into the United States, whether we have standing army or not, or citizen militias. So, okay, laws to be harsh. I don't know whether I want to go into the details about all this. But if you, assuming you've read it, okay, if you have not finished it yet, please go on and do read it all. It's not very long. It's a pretty short text. I mean, this is it basically. But what I want to sort of just say a word about before we leave is the Mandrake. The Mandrake is a comedy, weirdly enough, and it is, in a weird way, a dramatic representation of this idea that sometimes you need to do awful things to have a good final outcome. Now, the play is about trickery. It's about this Calimico, who's this, or Callimaco, I don't know how you say his name, a Florentine merchant, and his servant Ciro, who kind of engineers this whole thing. This Florentine lawyer who's an idiot. Oh, sorry, Ligurio is the guy who engineers everything. He's the parasite. And this friar who does dreadful things in the story also. And then Lucrezia, who's the wife of this older lawyer, who the young man, Calimico, falls in love with. And they have to... So what they end up doing is they... let me see if I can remember this. They lie to the lawyer, telling him that his wife is never going to get pregnant unless someone else sleeps with him first, and they give this potion to his wife so she'll sleep with him, but that person is going to die, and of course they're making that part up. And in the end, he does sleep with her. The wife and the mother conspires with the wife to get her to sleep with this young guy. And in the end, she gets pregnant, and they live happily ever after. Even though there's deception and everything dreadful happens in it, I'm going to really try and find us the play is funny as hell. You'd never think of Machiavelli, that stern kind of individual writing the Mandrake, but it is really, really hilarious and important, kind of in the history of theater also. There are many productions are done of this, and it's just one of those things also, there's so few characters that it really works in a small class like ours. We're not going to get back, I'm sorry to say, in this semester, but I'm going to look, if I can find a production of this, I'll post it online, and we can all watch it at our own leisure. So I guess what I should mention, I'm not really certain where we're going to go next week, but at some point, I guess we have about, it's now April, so we have probably 4 weeks, not even 4 full weeks left to the course. I probably have about, I don't know, 9 or 10 more lectures. Something. I have a lot more. I'm not sure exactly, but I think we're going to probably go into the Reformation. And what I'm going to do is let me tell you, I have a lecture about the Reformation already on YouTube. It's a big, broad thing that I did for a Western Civ class last year. I'm going to obviously give you much, much more detail. So I think what I'm going to do is talk about the late medieval church in detail in one lecture, talk about the real Luther in another talk, talk about Zwingli definitely in a whole talk in Switzerland, and oddly I know a lot more now about Zwingli than I ever did before I went to Switzerland last year to find Zwingli, oddly enough, for this whole larger project I've been working on for years about fasting, strangely enough. We'll talk about Calvin, we'll talk about the Catholic Reformation, and Ignatius Loyola and the Jesuits. We'll talk about the English Reformation. We'll talk about the Anabaptists. So that's 7 lectures at the very least. I'll probably throw in a few about popular culture and literature and language maybe. So I think we'll make it to the end of the semester very easily. But unless there's something else I'm going to plug in here, let's expect to move for the next 4 weeks into religion, into the Reformation. Okay, so I'll see you next time.